Welcome to Tier 3 of the Women Serial Killer Iceberg chart. If you've been following along, or maybe you just know already, there aren't as many well-known women serial killers compared to men. So usually in iceberg charts, the ranking usually starts at the tip of the iceberg, which was Tier 1, where we talk about the more well-known women serial killers. But by the end of Tier 2, they're really not well-known at all, and we have 3 more tiers to discuss. So for these deeper tiers, I ranked them based on the level of depravity of the crime, which is very difficult to do because, as you will realize, they're all very dark and depraved in their own way. But I did go about it the best I could, and we'll cut all the chit-chat here and just get started on Tier 3. Dorothy Williams. Dorothy Williams was a Chicago-based serial killer convicted of murdering 3 elderly individuals in the 1980s. She targeted vulnerable victims, strangling them during robberies to steal cash and valuables, which she used to fund her drug addiction. Williams was eventually caught, convicted, and sentenced to death in 1990, making her one of the very few women on death row at the time. Klimek. Klimek was a Polish-American serial killer who operated in Chicago during the early 20th century. She was convicted of killing her 3rd husband using arsenic and was suspected of killing multiple others, including previous husbands, relatives, and even neighbors. Tilly would allegedly predict the deaths of her victims to avoid suspicion, all while poisoning them to death. Her primary motive appeared to be financial gain, as she benefited from life insurance payouts and inheritance. Her crimes came to light when one of her husbands survived the poisoning, leading to an investigation that exhumed several bodies of her victims. In 1923, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, where she died in 1936. Velma Barfield. Velma Barfield was a Southern widow with a very tragic past. She was raised in an abusive household and sought to escape through marriage. But after a hysterectomy and chronic pain, she developed a crippling addiction to prescription drugs. Her life then spiraled into a pattern of fraud, manipulation, and murder, often targeting those who trusted her the most. Beginning with her first husband, who suspiciously perished in a house fire, Barfield went on to care for and quietly take the lives of at least 6 people, including her own mother and multiple elderly employers. She would lace tea and beer with arsenic and would slip it into the drinks while she played the concerned nurse in the situation. When her final victim, her boyfriend Roland Stewart Taylor, became suspicious of her financial crimes, she poisoned him too, which then led to her arrest. On death row, Barfield claimed to have found God, ministered to fellow inmates, and became a controversial figure. In 1984, Velma became the first woman executed in the United States since 1962. I'm not one to glamorize serial killers. I actually think that's really gross. So please don't take what I'm about to say as that. Velma Barfield was a rotten, disgusting, evil woman who just happened to have a great final meal choice. It was cheese doodles and a Coke. I just felt like that was critical information to share with you. Christine Falling. Born into extreme poverty with a father old enough to be her great-grandfather and a teenage mother, Christine Falling's childhood was marked by neglect, abuse, and a disturbing fascination with death. She was known to test the 9 lives theory of cats by throwing them off roofs. I am saying that while staring at my 2 beautiful feline angels, and I'm horrified at that thought. But it was an ominous foreshadowing of her future crimes. At just 14 years old, Christine was forced into marriage, which lasted all of 6 weeks. And by the age of 16, she was declared mentally incapacitated. Despite her documented history of hallucinations and violent tendencies, Falling found work as a babysitter, which proved to be a fatal mistake for at least 5 young children. Over the course of 2 years, she suffocated infants and toddlers with pillows and blankets, later claiming voices commanded her to kill the baby. Even after a doctor warned authorities about her involvement, a lost note let her slip through the cracks until her final victim in 1982. Falling confessed to 3 murders, dodging the death penalty but earning life behind bars. She is currently imprisoned in Florida. Reta Mays. Reta Mays was a trusted nursing assistant at the Lewis A. Johnson Veterans Medical Center until elderly patients began dying under very bizarre circumstances. Mays was a former corrections officer with a history of alleged inmate abuse and also had no medical certification, by the way, but worked the overnight shift at this VA center. While there, she secretly injected patients with insulin they did not need. Over 11 months, at least 7 veterans ranging from World War II to Vietnam soldiers suffered fatal blood sugar crashes, many slipping into comas before their death. Hospital staff did pick up this disturbing pattern, but Mays remained free for years, even watching Nurses Who Kill, the show, and researching female serial killers while the investigation unfolded. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence, including a recorded call where she wished she could strangle a patient, Mays broke down in court, admitting to the murders but offering no clear motive beyond feeling a sense of control. The judge, however, had no sympathy, calling her the worst kind of monster. In 2021, she was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms, ensuring she would never walk free again. Madame de Brinvilliers. Madame de Brinvilliers, born Marie Madeleine D'Aubray in 17th century France, was a notorious poisoner whose crimes shocked the aristocracy. She poisoned her father and 2 brothers with arsenic in a bid to inherit their wealth and maintain her lavish lifestyle. Brinvilliers also tested poisons on hospital victims to perfect her method. Her crimes came to light when her lover/accomplice died, and incriminating letters were found among his possessions. She fled to England, but was eventually caught and brought back to France for her trial. In 1676, she was convicted of multiple murders and executed by beheading, followed by her body being burned at the stake. Mary Cowan. Mary Cowan had very similar crimes. She was a 19th century serial killer who poisoned her husband and her children using arsenic. Her crimes were also financially motivated. She wanted those life insurance payouts. Her calculated use of poison, which you may already know, was a very common method among women killers at the time. And the use of the poison allowed her to evade suspicion initially, as the deaths were attributed to illness. She was eventually caught when authorities started to pick up on the pattern. Their investigation revealed the presence of arsenic in her victims' remains. Cowan was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Kimberly Saenz. Kimberly Saenz was supposed to be saving lives at the DaVita dialysis clinic in Lufton, Texas, but instead she turned routine treatments into death sentences. She was a nurse with a troubling history. She was fired from multiple healthcare jobs and caught stealing Demerol, yet she still managed to land a position at this clinic, where patients soon began suffering from sudden cardiac arrest. In April 2008, emergency calls to the clinic skyrocketed, with paramedics raising red flags after witnessing an alarming pattern. The real horror unfolded when witnesses caught Saenz drawing bleach into syringes and injecting it directly into patients' dialysis lines. A forensic breakthrough linked her to multiple deaths, revealing that the bleach caused hemolysis, a very gruesome sounding process. I guess the red cells explode, and that leads to fatal organ failure. Google searches on bleach poisoning and casual complaints about patients she disliked sealed her fate. In 2012, Saenz was convicted of murdering 5 patients and injuring 5 others. Even in court, officials suspected she had claimed more victims than could be proven. She dodged the death penalty but received life without parole. Helen, Golay, and Olga Rutterschmidt. Helen, Golay, and Olga Rutterschmidt were not your typical little old ladies, unless your grandma dabbles in multi-million-dollar insurance fraud and murder. The 2 pensioners spent their years preying on homeless men, luring them in with food and shelter before secretly taking out massive life insurance policies in their names. Once all the paperwork was in place, Olga and Helen staged their victims' death as hit and runs, collecting over $2 million in payouts. But their luck ran out when insurance companies grew suspicious. As insurance companies do, they don't want to pay out even for regular valid instances. That suspicion led to finding surveillance footage that linked Helen and Olga to McDavid's death. At their trial, the 2 bickered back and forth like an old married couple. Rutterschmidt was even whining, she's the boss, as if being the subordinate who committed fraud and murder was any better. In 2008, both were convicted and sentenced to life. Now, in their 90s, these women are spending their golden years behind bars. Suzan Carson. Suzan Carson and her husband Michael Bear Carson were a nomadic, drug-fueled couple who saw themselves as warriors on a mission to rid the world of witches, though their definition of witch seemed to apply to anyone who irritated them. Between 1981 and 1983, they brutally murdered at least 3 people in California. Their roommates, Karen Barnes, marijuana farm worker Clark Stevens, and Good Samaritan John Charles Helyar, who made the fatal mistake of giving them a ride. Their crimes stemmed from, of course, the drugs and also some apocalyptic beliefs, earned them the nickname the San Francisco Witch Killers. After their dramatic capture following a high-speed chase, the Carsons gleefully confessed, then later retracted their statements and pleaded not guilty. Convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, they remained unrepentant, insisting they had been on a holy mission. Investigators suspect that there may have been more victims, but their full body count may never be known. On June 12, 1984, the Carsons were convicted of their first murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. They later received 50 years to life for the second murder and 75 years to life for the third. In 1989, their convictions were upheld on appeal, so Michael and Suzan will be behind bars for the rest of their lives. Polly Bartlett. Polly Bartlett, a 19th century innkeeper in Wyoming, is often referred to in folklore as a female serial killer who poisoned many guests at her boarding house. Allegedly, Bartlett targeted wealthy travelers, serving them poisoned meals, then stealing their cash and valuables. The victims were reportedly buried on her property, and her crimes were discovered when a very prominent guest disappeared. However, much of Polly Bartlett's story is considered legend, with little concrete evidence to support the claims of mass murder. Some historians suggest that the idea that she was a serial killer is very exaggerated or made up entirely as sort of a cautionary tale about the dangers of frontier life. Helene Auguste Geisen-Volk. This name is like the final boss. Okay, here we go. Helene Auguste Geisen-Volk was a German serial killer who murdered several people in the early 20th century. She worked as a housekeeper and over time poisoned her victims with arsenic. Geisen-Volk's crimes primarily targeted elderly individuals, including members of the families she worked for. She would gain their trust, administer the poison, and then nurse them back to health to cover up her actions and gain their favor. Her exact victim count is unclear, but she was suspected of multiple murders across various households. She was arrested after a series of suspicious deaths linked to her poisonings. Geisen-Volk was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, though the details of her eventual fate remain a bit ambiguous. Kristin GIlbert. Kristin GIlbert was a registered nurse with a deadly obsession, creating medical emergencies to gain attention. Dubbed the Angel of Death by her coworkers at the Northampton VA Medical Center, GIlbert would inject patients with lethal doses of epinephrine, triggering fatal heart attacks. Suspicious nurses noticed the spike in deaths under her care, and when an investigation began, GIlbert tried to derail it with a bomb threat. Prosecutors argued that she did all of this to impress her then-boyfriend, a hospital security officer required to respond to medical emergencies. With potential links to over 350 deaths, she was convicted in 2001 of murdering 4 patients and attempting to kill 2 others. Although the case qualified for the death penalty, she was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. Faye Copeland. Faye Copeland, along with her husband Ray, yes, Ray and Faye, became the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the U.S. for a brutal series of murders committed on their Missouri farm. While Ray was a lifelong con man, Faye was either his obedient wife or his cold-blooded partner in crime. I'm sure the truth is somewhere in the middle, and depending on who you ask. Together, they lured drifters to work as farmhands, using them to cash fraudulent checks before Ray executed them to cover his tracks. When authorities searched their farm in 1989, they uncovered multiple bodies, all shot with the same rifle found in the Copelands' home. There was also a handwritten ledger, I believe it was in Faye's handwriting, with the names of the farmhands, and there were X's next to the farmhands who had died. Faye was sentenced to death in 1990, but her sentence was reduced to life without parole. After a stroke in 2002 left her unable to speak, she was granted medical parole and died in a nursing home. Elizabeth Wettlaufer. Elizabeth Wettlaufer was a registered nurse who turned long-term care facilities into her personal hunting ground. Struggling with substance abuse and a history of misconduct, Elizabeth quietly injected vulnerable patients with lethal doses of insulin, often escaping detection as the deaths were attributed to natural causes. Her killing spree spanned nearly a decade, with 8 confirmed murders and several more attempted poisonings. Despite coworkers raising concerns about her behavior, Wettlaufer continued working in various care homes until she voluntarily confessed in 2016 while in drug rehab. She later claimed she was driven by uncontrollable surges and even blamed divine forces for her actions. In 2017, she was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. Her crimes led to a public inquiry into Ontario's long-term care system, exposing critical failures that allowed her to continue working despite multiple red flags. That is so scary. It's pretty unfortunate that one of Canada's most notorious serial killers is how the failures were exposed in the healthcare system, and even scarier that it was only because she spoke up and not because they figured her out. Elfriede Blauensteiner. Elfriede Blauensteiner was a gambling addict who poisoned wealthy elderly men and forged their wills to fund her habit. She targeted these men through romantic relationships, slowly poisoning them while ensuring their assets were left to her. In 1997, she was convicted of murdering a 77-year-old, with her lawyer also jailed for helping falsify his will. 4 years later, she was found guilty of killing her husband and an elderly neighbor, but authorities suspected she had at least 10 victims. Elfriede showed absolutely no remorse. She even wrote a memoir detailing her crimes. After serving just 7 years of her life sentence, she died of a brain tumor in 2003, taking her full body count to the grave. Anna Margaretha Zwanziger. Anna Margaretha Zwanziger was a German serial killer who worked as a housekeeper for many judges in Germany between 1801 and 1811. She did use, you guessed it, arsenic, which she referred to as her truest friend, to poison her employers and others around her. I know this does sound very similar to one of our previous entries. Like I said in the last 2 tier videos, there are a lot of familiar patterns, a lot of seemingly similar stories. It is very strange, but I promise these are 2 totally different people. That being said, Zwanziger would poison her victims, then nurse them back to health, like that previous entry, to gain their favor, all while plotting their demise. She killed at least 4 people, including a baby, and attempted to poison several others. Her crimes were uncovered when a pattern of deaths raised suspicions, and she was eventually tried and convicted of murder in 1811. During her trial, she did admit to the crimes and showed remorse, acknowledging that she would likely never be able to stop killing. She was then executed via beheading in 1811. Marianne Nölle. Marianne Nölle is another German serial killer who was convicted of 7 murders and sentenced to life in prison in 1993. As a nurse, Nölle used her position to poison her patients, administering lethal doses of Truxol, which is a sedative, between 1984 and 1992. Her actions went unnoticed for years, and the deaths of her victims were attributed to natural causes. Although the police suspect she was responsible for killing 17 other people and attempted to murder 18 others, Nölle has never confessed to any of her crimes. She was eventually caught after a detailed investigation connected the dots on the suspicious killings, and those dots all led back to her. As I mentioned, Nölle was convicted of 7 murders and is currently serving life in prison. And that is it for tier 3. We still have a long way to go. We have many more female serial killers to discuss. There will be a total of 5 tiers, so make sure you like and subscribe so you catch the next one, and I will see you in tier 4.